Thank you, everyone, for coming again to another HPL seminar. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Olivia Bruce, PhD candidate with Brent Edwards. She'll be defending her PhD in April, so that's very exciting. Before coming to the University of Calgary, Olivia did her BSc at Queen's University in kinesiology, where she studied the effect of fatigue on double under turning technique in CrossFit athletes under the supervision of Steve Fisher. She then came in 2016 to the University of Calgary to do her master's degree in kinesiology with Brent Edwards, where she studied towards the real-time understanding of real-time monitoring of Achilles tendon strain, which was in basketball players. And now she is doing work that using imaging-based modeling to better understand the structure-function relationships, pathology, and risk factors for overuse injuries. After she finishes here, she's going to go continue on to do a postdoc. So that's very exciting, but you'll have to wait to hear where. Without further ado, then I'll leave it to Olivia, who's going to give us a talk titled Tibial-fibular morphology variations associated with elevated bone strain and sex disparity.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Michael. Okay, so stress fractures are common injuries in runners and military personnel. So in the military, you see about a 5 to 10% incidence in new recruits undergoing basic training within the first 2 to 3 months where they're doing this training. So we can see that in particular, there's a big peak between 5 and 9 weeks. This is from a very large prospective study in the US military. In runners, the incidence is a little bit lower, usually reported somewhere between 1 and 5%. We'll also note that we can see in this figure that the incidence of stress fractures in females is much larger when compared to males. In this particular study in the US military, it was 4.4 times greater incidence in the females when compared to males. Now that incidence that disparity in incidence is lower when you look at athletes like cross-country runners, but it is still definitely a difference and very notable to look at. Most stress fractures occur at the tibia, and so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Also note that this is a debilitating fracture, so it takes up to at least 10 weeks to recover and return to activity. So it's costly to both runners as well as to the military, and it's one of the reasons they do a lot of work trying to prevent these fractures. So the development of stress fractures is associated with mechanical fatigue. And we've talked about this, Michael went into detail about 2 weeks ago, I guess, in his talk. So mechanical fatigue occurs when you have microdamage accumulation in a tissue due to repetitive submaximal loading. So as that damage accumulates, that can affect the tissue material properties negatively. On the other hand, you can have repair. And so the bone will adapt and remodel. But if that rate of damage accumulation is greater than the rate of repair over time, it may eventually lead to a stress fracture. Now, it's important to note that stress and strain magnitude are strongly related to the accumulation of microdamage. So these are important factors. I think it's really nicely shown in this figure from Cheryl Patton in Dennis Carter's lab from 1981. So this is from fatigue tests where each line is representing a different sample that was loaded in fatigue. We have the normalized secant modulus on the y-axis, and that's indicative of tissue properties and the accumulation of damage. We have the number of cycles on a log scale on the x-axis. And the strain that each sample was loaded at is shown in the brackets. And so we can see that these samples that were loaded at very high strains accumulate a lot of damage very quickly and only lasted far fewer cycles before they fractured when compared to the samples loaded at much lower initial strain rates. Initial strains, not strain rates, sorry. Now, strain is a complex function of bone geometry, material properties, and the applied loads. These factors are thought to contribute to the disparity in risk between individuals and also between sexes. So, for example, studies that have looked at differences in bone geometry between males and females typically are using peripheral quantitative computed tomography to look at transverse cross-sectional geometry. And they do find differences. So females illustrate smaller cortical thickness as well as dimensions. The problem with this is that we're only looking at a single slice, maybe at a handful of locations along the tibia, and we're limited to looking at transverse cross-sectional dimensions. There might be other variations in tibial and fibular geometry that we're missing that could be important. Another approach is to use subject-specific finite element modeling when you have the whole CT or the CT of the whole bone. And that way you also get the mechanical implications of those differences in geometry. That said, with finite element modeling based on CT, it's very difficult to pull apart differences in geometry and figure out which features are the most important and which features are actually contributing to that difference in strain that you might be seeing. The big question is, how do we identify which parameters are most important? And that brings me to statistical shape and appearance modeling. So statistical shape models, you may have heard about these. They are ways to calculate the average geometry and principal modes of variation of geometry from a training set, where that training set is representative of your population of interest. And so we can see in the figure here, there's an example of a few principal components from one of my tibia fibula models, where the red and blue indicate models where I've perturbed them by plus or minus 3 standard deviations along each of the principal components independently. So we can see principal component 1 in this case is generally describing scaling. The next principal component is a little bit harder to interpret. We can see a little bit of length change relative to change in width. And then the third principal component here we can kind of see is describing some sagittal plane curvature. And so we do these visualizations to help us interpret what each of the principal components are describing. Now, there are a lot of applications for this technique. You can identify features that distinguish between two groups, and that's something that we'll be talking about today. Other applications include automated segmentation algorithms and generating simulated populations. Now, statistical appearance models are a little bit less common in the literature, where they include both geometry and density. So again, you're calculating the average geometry and density and the principal ways that those vary within a population. Again, we can use this to identify features that distinguish between two groups and generate simulated populations. And that's particularly used in orthopedic applications, where you can generate a population and test and design orthopedic implants in silico before you actually go forward to manufacturing and testing those destructively. Now, I was interested in using statistical shape and appearance models to look at how geometry and density in the tibia and fibula vary within a young, healthy population, and also look at what are the mechanical implications of those variations. So today I'll be talking about 3 studies that make up about 3/4 of my dissertation work. So first we'll be talking about statistical shape modeling, and I use that to look at sex differences in geometry, and also look at how well I could predict whole bone geometry from just a handful of anatomic landmarks. And we'll talk about why I wanted to do that in a bit. The second study will look at a statistical appearance model, so again, incorporating geometry and density, and using that to look at which features are the most important mechanically, and as well as sex differences. And finally, I'll be cross-validating some of those sex differences that we saw. Okay. So this first study, again, I was developing a statistical shape model of the tibia and fibula complex, and then used that to evaluate how well I could reconstruct whole bone shape from a handful of landmarks, and to look at whether or not there are any sex differences that are present in this group. So the training set is very important when you're building these models. You want them to be representative of your population as much as possible, and they are sensitive to that training set. So I had 19 males and 22 females that were collected by Michael Bagley as part of some of his running studies. They were 18 to 23 years old, physically active at least 3 times per week. And this initial study these studies were collected as part of running studies for sort of the US military. So it was aimed at getting a population of individuals who would be representative of people that would be entering basic training. This study also aimed to recruit people with various different statures. And so we got a very large range of bone lengths and bone sizes. So this is a general overview of how to create a statistical shape model. I started with CT scans of the lower leg and foot from the 41 participants. I segmented out the tibia and fibula, and then exported those as STLs. I chose a reference shape from those 41 individuals as the person who had the surface area closest to the mean. So I'm trying to get someone who has about a mean size of bone. From there, I take those surface nodes and apply the coherent point drift algorithm to obtain node correspondence. And so what this algorithm is essentially doing is it's comparing 2 sets of node coordinates that are, we call them point clouds, and we can kind of see this in the red and blue in the image in the middle. And it's figuring out for each node in the reference mesh, anatomically what node in the individual's mesh corresponds. Okay, so once I had that, I aligned all of the meshes with Procrustes alignment and applied a principal components analysis to obtain my statistical shape model. And again, we can see a familiar image showing some of those principal components and what they describe. From there, I decided to keep 8 principal components, and that was based on an analysis that's described by May et al. And I won't go into details, but I'm happy to forward it along the paper if anyone would like to know how that's done. Okay. So this first analysis, once I had the shape model, I wanted to see how well I could predict whole bone shape from a handful of anatomic landmarks. So one of the reasons that this is of interest is that people are interested in, can we create more subject-specific musculoskeletal models? Currently, the standard is to take a generic model that's often built based on older cadaveric samples or specimens, and then you just scale them to match the participant segment lengths. The idea is that if you could have a statistical shape model, you could maybe get more individual-specific geometry, and that might be important for getting more accurate joint contact centers and muscle moment arms. So I had 2 landmark sets that I identified on the bones, and these were manually placed by myself on the bone surfaces. So I had 9 landmarks, which are circled in red, and those ones are the ones that are in theory palpable. So while I'm using bone surface landmarks, in the future, those could be identified using skin-mounted markers. I also wanted to see if I could get better reconstructions if I had additional information that you couldn't get through palpation. And so there are some additional markers that are placed on the posterior side of the tibia and fibula as well. So tibia and fibula geometries, I reconstructed these by morphing the statistical shape model along each of the first 8 principal components so that you minimize the sum of squared distances between the model predicted landmark locations and the target landmarks for each individual. I also created a model where I just isotropically scaled the bone based on segment lengths to get a generic model. That said, that generic model was specific to the population, and so we'd expect that to be a bit more accurate than what you typically get from a scaled model from OpenSim, for example. Okay. So once I had those reconstructed meshes, I aligned them with the CT-based mesh for each individual and calculated some error measures. So root mean square error is the distance between corresponding points. Maximum error, as well as Jacquard index. And this is a measure of volumetric similarity where 1 would be perfect overlap and the two shapes are identical, and 0 would be that these shapes don't overlap at all. Okay. And we found that our shape model did work better than the isotropic scaling. And so our root mean square error, maximum error, and Jacquard index were all different when compared to the isotropic scaling, and we saw improvements of about 9 to 15%. Now, I wanted to see whether these would actually make a difference in our musculoskeletal modeling results. And so I Frankensteined in the tibia. So I scaled the Arnold model from OpenSim to the segment lengths. I aligned the tibia, the reconstructed tibia, with the model's tibia, inserted it, and then we brought the model through a range of motion at the knee and at the ankle, and calculated the moment arms throughout that range of motion, and the moment arms are only minimally affected. These biceps femoris, short and long head, and semimembranosus were the only muscles where we saw a significant difference at some point in the muscle moment arms. But as you can see, those differences are between the models are very, very small, and we wouldn't expect that to really affect the muscle forces that are coming out of the model. Okay. So I also looked at sexual dimorphism. And so something that you can calculate out of the principal components analysis is scores. And what these scores represent is a weighting factor that's applied to each principal component that represents how far away from the mean each individual is along that particular variance in shape. So we can see this. The axes on this plot are in standard deviation, and each dot represents an individual. So for example, this individual here, it's about, say, 1.2 standard deviations from the mean along principal component 4. And so I compared scores between males and females for each principal component to see if any were statistically different. And principal component 4 and principal component 7 were. So principal component 4 described variation in transverse cross-sectional size throughout the bone, and particularly in the diaphysis, where the average female had a narrower bone than the average male. Principal component 7 described, again, transverse cross-sectional size of the proximal region of the tibia and fibula, where the male illustrated a larger condyles and tibial plateau than the average female. And we can see this in the reconstructed shapes here, where the blue would be indicative of the male perturbed by +2 standard deviations along each of those principal components, and the red being the female with -2 standard deviations along those principal components. Okay. So we saw differences in male versus female in terms of bone geometry. What about density? Because we know that density is important as well for strains. So this next study, I incorporated density into the model and aimed to quantify the influence of tibial-fibular geometry and density variations on fine element predicted strain, and was particularly interested in looking at those sex differences and whether they were large enough to produce an appreciable difference in strain. So I started out with the same population, but then we added in a few more individuals that were collected by Arash Kasatarash in our group. And I don't know if he's here today, but thank you, Arash. Yep. So again, these individuals were recruited for a running study, and they were a little bit older than the original group. So we expanded our age range from 18 to 32 years old. Again, these participants were physically active at least 3 times per week, and we maintained a fairly nice distribution of statures as well within the group. Okay, so this is the general overview of how to build a statistical appearance model. So you'll notice that it starts out fairly similar to building a shape model, but there are a lot more steps involved. And so we'll go through this in a fair bit of detail. So again, we start with the CT images of the left leg and foot and segmented out the tibia and fibula. For my reference shape, I used the average shape from the previous statistical shape model. From there, I meshed it into a tetrahedral mesh, and then used the surface nodes from that mesh to obtain node correspondence, again with the coherent point drift algorithm. And once I had correspondence between each node, I was able to calculate displacements. So for each node in the reference mesh, I knew how much you had to displace it to get to the corresponding node in each individual's mesh. Those displacements were used as boundary conditions to elastically morph the reference tetrahedral mesh to match each individual's surface. And that gives me element correspondence. Now from there, I can take that individualized mesh and overlay it back onto the CT data to assign density to each element. We had a hydroxyapatite phantom in each scan, and so from there we were able to build a linear relationship between Hounsfield units and apparent density. And so that was used to calculate what the densities would be for each element. Once that's done, I aligned the meshes and then applied a principal components analysis to the nodes to get the shape model, the densities to get an intensity model. We take the scores from each of those models and then normalize the scores in the shape model so that the total amount of variance in the shape model and the intensity model are the same. We then apply a principal component analysis to those normalized scores to obtain the combined statistical appearance model. And from there, I can control both shape and geometry, or geometry and density with the same parameters. Okay, so once I had the model, I created meshes by perturbing them, the average shape by plus and minus 1 and 2 standard deviations along the first 5 principal components independently. That was used for visualization as well as calculating strains and looking at which features are most important. I also calculated the average female and average male, controlled for isotropic scaling and associated variations in geometry and density. So these meshes were then used to construct finite element models. So we had heterogeneous orthotropic material properties that were assigned to each element based on that element's density. We applied the same boundary conditions across all models and applied loads that are representative of running. And these were calculated from gait data from one of the participants running at 3.3 meters per second and a musculoskeletal modeling pipeline that I think Michael talked about in detail 2 weeks ago. I should mention also that once those loads were calculated, they were scaled by mass to the average of the statistical appearance model, and then all the loads were the same across every single model. Okay, so once the models had run, we calculated pressure modified von Mises strain. And this is a modification of the von Mises strain criterion that accounts for the tension compression asymmetry observed in bone. I quantified the 95th percentile strain, which I'll call peak strain, as well as strain volume, which we defined as the volume of elements experiencing 4,000 microstrain or greater. And so I was comparing the perturbed models to the average model, and then the average female to the average male. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at some of the principal components and what they described for this model. So principal component 1, unsurprisingly, described isotropic scaling, and this accounted for about 50% of the total variance in the model. We also see, in addition to isotropic scaling, there is a change in cortical thickness. So as you scale the model down, you get a relative increase in cortical thickness. And essentially, this is if you were to scale a bone down by a lot, your cortical thickness would just wither away to nothing. And so that's that change in cortical thickness that we're seeing accounts for or prevents that. Okay, principal component 2 described sagittal plane curvature, as well as some concomitant changes in cortical thickness and cortical density. So we can see that the bone that's shaped here, that's more curved, shows a smaller cortical thickness and a reduced cortical density. The other 3 principal components largely describe changes in transverse cross-sectional geometry. And so, for example, this figure on your right is showing a cross-section from the mid-diaphysis. And we can see some changes in dimensions, in overall shape, as well as some differences in cortical density as well. Now we looked at the strain results. The sagittal plane diaphysis curvature and transverse plane cross-sectional dimensions illustrated the greatest influence on bone strain. So greater curvature and that concomitant decreased cortical thickness resulted in increased strain by up to 12% and a 95% increase in strained volume relative to the average model. Smaller transverse cross-sectional size, which is shown in the figure in the middle in those mid-diaphysis cross-sections, increased peak strain by up to 9% and increased strain volume by 66% when you perturb the model by 2 standard deviations and compare it to the mean. Now, those transverse cross-sectional geometry was also very important when we looked at differences between males and females. And that's kind of what we would expect based on that statistical shape modeling paper that I talked about earlier. So females illustrated a narrower tibia, smaller proximal condyles, and more dense cortical bone in the tibial diaphysis when compared to the males. And so we can see this in the figures. These appearances do look relatively subtle. But we can see that the average male has a wider bone than the average female. We can see, again, a larger cross-section in the average male than the average female. And this red here is indicating greater cortical density in the average female when compared to the average male. So these differences in bone geometry and density resulted in 6% greater peak strain and 41% greater strained volume in the tibial diaphysis in the average female when compared to the average male. And so the figure on the right represents the posterior surface of the tibial diaphysis. And we can see pressure modified von Mises strain plotted in the heat map or the color map. So the elements that are experiencing 4,000 microstrain or greater and would be included in that strain volume calculation are colored in black. And we can see that there's a slightly larger area in black in the female when compared to the male. Now, one of the awesome things about this statistical shape modeling and the appearance modeling approach is that I can then dig in further and tease apart, okay, is it geometry or density that's really driving this increase in strain? Is it a combination of the two? And look at their relative contributions. So if I perturbed density only, meaning I kept the average shape and only changed the density, that increased cortical density observed in the average female decreased strains by about 4% and 31% for strain volume when compared to the average male. On the other hand, the narrower tibial diaphysis really increased strains to a much greater degree, so that when you have the combined model, the effect on strain is really dominated by the geometry differences. And so that leads us to believe that geometry is really what's driving this difference in bone strain that we see between males and females. And if anything, that increased cortical density that we observe in the females is acting to offset the negative consequences of having a narrow bone. All right, so I don't know about you, but those results were very exciting to me. I was able to see the differences between males and females. We saw a big mechanical difference. So we wanted to make sure, though, that those results were valid. We had somewhat of a small to moderate sample size of 22 females and 20 females, 28 males. So we wanted to do a cross-validation just to double check that those results were consistent within the population. So I collected a new data set of 15 males and 15 females, 18 to 32 years of age. They were all physically active at least 3 times per week. And again, I wanted to make sure that I was obtaining a range of statures so that I was testing this model and validating it, not just on people of average size, but people who were very tall and very short as well. Okay. The data processing was very similar. So we start again by segmenting the tibia and fibula from CT images. I used the exact same reference mesh as before, and the same process for establishing node correspondence, element correspondence, and then assigning density values based on that underlying CT data. From there, I fit the statistical appearance model to the new each individual's mesh. And that was done with an optimization that minimized a weighted sum of the differences between the model and target nodes and density values. From there, the first principal component, which remember describes isotropic scaling, I removed that from each of the individual CT-based mesh, and then from there calculated the average female and the average male. Fine element models were constructed, as we just talked about before, where we're applying heterogeneous orthotropic material properties, and those are assigned based on each element's density value. The exact same boundary conditions and loads were used. And we saw great results. This was very encouraging. So we can see the validation cohort is that new cohort of 30 that I collected, and the initial cohort that was used to create the model is what I'll call the model cohort. And so we can see in both groups, the average female illustrated a narrower tibia than the average male. And it's illustrated nicely here. Again, these results were relatively subtle, but they do seem to have a mechanical implication. We also saw that increase in cortical density in the average female when compared to the average male. The only difference we really see between these two cohorts is that the cortical thickness disparity between males and females was larger in that validation cohort. So we can see, this decrease. So this indicates, the blue indicates lower density in the average female when compared to the average male. This occurs near the endocortical surface, and so that to me indicates that the average female is showing a smaller cortical thickness than the average male. All right, because we saw very similar geometry and density differences between males and females in both cohorts, we'd expect to see very similar differences in strain, and we do. So these heat maps, again, are showing pressure modified von Mises strain across the posterior side of the posterior surface of the tibia. The bounding boxes indicate the areas or the volumes that are included in the analysis. And so that the orange colors are indicating the areas that are included in that strain volume calculation, so 4,000 microstrain or greater. So the average female model in the validation cohort illustrated 10% greater peak strain, and 80% greater strained volume when compared to the average male. And we can see that in both cases, we see a smaller area of those high strain elements in the male when compared to the female. We also notice that in the validation cohort, we see slightly larger differences in strain, and that can be attributed to that greater difference in cortical thickness between the average female and the average male. All right, so what does this mean in the context of stress fracture? So remember back to the beginning talk, we talked about how strain magnitude is strongly associated with fatigue life. Now this is a strain life plot with strain range on the y-axis and the number of cycles to failure on the x-axis in a log scale. Now these relationships, strain life relationships, are usually described in bone with an inverse power law. And so what that means is if you have a small change in strain magnitude, you're going to have a much larger change in the number of cycles before a bone fractures. A bone also exhibits a statistical size effect. So if you have samples of bone, that you load in fatigue at the same strain, initial strain, the samples that have a larger volume are going to illustrate a shorter fatigue life than the samples with smaller volume. And this is related to the microstructure of bone. And so this image is from one of Lindsay Loundigan's papers showing the cortical bone microstructure. And Lindsay's here today. Hi. Yeah. Okay, and so if you have a larger volume of bone, you are more likely to load an area containing a microstructural weakness or a flaw. And so, for example, we can see that if we're taking some small samples of bone, you might not get an area with a really large pore. Whereas if you have a large volume, you're more likely to get an area with a large pore that acts as a stress concentration or some other flaw that would reduce the strength of that tissue. And in fact, in tests of whole bone, strain volume was actually more strongly related to fatigue life than peak strain. And so this figure is from an experiment in our lab where whole rabbit tibiae were loaded in compression and torsion and also in fatigue. So finite element calculated strain is on the x-axis and the number of cycles to failure is on the y-axis. And again, this is on a log scale. And this relationship between the number of cycles to failure and strain volume is described by a logarithmic function. And so we can see that a small change in strain volume of about 40% results in almost a threefold increase in the number of cycles before a fracture would occur. So we can see that even though the geometry differences between the average male and female looked very subtle, mechanically, we do think they're meaningful. And these results suggest that bone geometry very likely contributes to that disparity in stress fracture risk between males and females. Now, there are some limitations to these studies. So, for example, I've focused on bone geometry and density. And that was deliberate. I really wanted to isolate those differences and how bone geometry and density independently contribute to bone strain and maybe the disparity in risk between stress fractures for males and females. That said, it has been suggested that loads might differ between males and females during running. For example, it's been shown that females illustrate greater medial lateral forces in running when compared to males. We also modeled muscle attachments as concentrated forces that are applied at a single node in the mesh. And that's not realistic. Muscles are attached across the bone, across an area. And it's also been shown that muscle insertion areas may vary between individuals and sexes. That said, we don't actually know whether these differences would be sufficient to produce changes in bone strain, peak strain, or strain volume metrics. And that's something I'm looking forward to actually diving into. I have a few studies planned that where I want to look at the interaction between loads and geometry and look at the sensitivity of these models to changes in load as well. Okay. So to summarize, what I really want you to take away from this talk today was that diaphysis curvature and transverse cross-sectional geometry are the key features in the tibia that influence bone strain. And in particular, smaller cross-sectional geometry observed in females when compared to males results in elevated bone strain and strained volume. These findings do seem to be consistent in multiple samples from the same population, and they do seem to be valid. And that these bone geometry likely contributes to the higher risk of tibial stress fracture in females when compared to males. And so thank you for listening. I would also like to thank my co-authors on some of these papers. So my advisor, Brent Edwards, it's been an awesome 6.5 years so far. I've learned so much. Michael Bagley, Ifas Hyder, and Arash Kasatarash, we've all been working kind of on the same musculoskeletal modeling, fine element modeling pathway. And so having them to chat to about implementation issues to theory to applications has been awesome. The rest of the lab and my funding sources. And we're good to take questions now.
Right. That was delightful, so I hope everyone has any questions. So I'm going to start us off. Okay. I guess you kind of stole the one question I had. But I did, yeah, I guess it's the next paper you're working on where you can use the sex-specific loads. The last one was just the same loads as
the last one was the same loads across all. And so I think there's a few studies that I'd like to do. One where I'm trying to figure out how much do you have to change a load from a particular muscle force or contact force in order to change the strains. So looking at sensitivity of bone strain to load. The other side is definitely looking at better characterizing differences in loading patterns between males and females, and then applying that in combination with the geometry to see if it actually is sufficient to contribute to that difference in strain.
Can I just follow up on that, because that's exactly the idea that I had. Was, it seemed that you applied the same loading to the different bones, the male and female bones, and
yep.
I would assume that bone adapts in such a way that strains would be always the same, independent if you are a tall woman or a small woman, or a big man or a small man. So that I would have assumed that if somebody is 6'6" and 120 kilos, they would have bigger bones than somebody that's 5'5" and 60 pounds, so that the strain would be kind of controlled by the way the bone is built. And so therefore, I wonder if there's actually strain differences between men and women. I just would have seen that as a principle, how the body works. But.
Yeah, well, I get various combinations of this question because I don't know exactly how loads, I don't know if anyone's really characterized the relationship between body size and how loads scale with that. Whether it's mass or height or a combination of the two.
Not even body size, just, for example, I read this study about, these soccer players that were between 60 and 70 and they have played soccer all life long, and their bone mineral density seemed to be that of 20-year-old boys. So it seems bone is really fabulous at adapting to the loading, and I would just thought that if you run a lot, if you ski a lot, if you play a lot of soccer, or if you don't do anything at all, that your bone would adapt in a way that I would have thought that strain would be kind of controlled.
And maybe it is. It's something that we can definitely look into with the data set that I have. Yeah, it's totally possible. And it might be that there are some variances in loading relative to geometry or bone size, and that it's just not enough to change and make an appreciable change in strain. We don't know.
guess to follow up on that, I would say like you can't have it, but the strengths are the same. Otherwise, the stress fracture is have to be the same for the two sexes. So at some point, there has to be a difference in concentration.
Well, I would note that, one of the points of this study, or I guess the few studies that I presented, is I was controlling for isotropic scaling. So this is kind of like with which is dominated by bone length. But so if you control for scaling, which is similar to saying, if you have two people that are around the same height, male and female, so bone size is controlled for, the female's still going to illustrate a more narrow bone. And so that geometry difference does seem to, well, we think it really contributes to the disparity in risk, along with the many other factors, of course.
I want to follow up on Michael, so let's assume, some of this data that seems to be very convincing seems to be coming from the army. So let's assume, the average woman and the average man goes to the army, and then we have to carry all this pack and have to run 20 kilometers. We have to do these things that are challenging to both of us, but overall, they might be more challenging to the average woman, and in a relative sense, load that more, and so therefore, maybe that system is not as well adapted as the average male system, and so you have these things because of the relative increase in loading to what you normally do that would tend to be higher to the average woman compared to the average man. I mean, maybe that's the explanation.
Yeah. Well, I think that accounts for so like in the general population, you get like 2 to 3 times higher incidence in females, but in the military, you get around 4.5, let's say. And I think that accounts for that, that extra little bit. Within the general population of people kind of do the same things. It's not like, men and women, professional runners run drastically different mileages. They do a little bit, but like they're still doing kind of like the same intense training.
Yeah,
I
agree.
But I'm thinking back to that, like Stacy's study that we did, that was published last year. We did stress rather than strain, and the stress was definitely higher than female bones because of the force and the geometric differences. But I guess with your the density results,
it would, if anything, the difference in stress would maybe be a little bit overestimated.
Yeah. I don't know. That's an interesting question.
That said, when you factor in that greater change in cortical thickness that we saw in the second cohort, the density that also offsets the change in cortical density. So the density might not play much of a role. But yeah, if anything, you probably just overestimated the difference.
All right, I'm asking, do you think, are there microstructural differences? You're wrote in here now. Guest of honor. So do you think there are differences in microstructure between males and females?
Yeah, there definitely are, but my question is always does it make a difference in comparison to geometry differences? My gut tells me that geometry would actually dominate, so your stuff is probably more applicable than my stuff, but yeah, I've always wondered that, but I do geometry differences.
And would that maybe hold, do you think that holds with as people age? I've looked at young, healthy, active people. If we were looking at, say, masters athletes, do you think that difference, think the geometry still dominates?
Not sure, because that's a good point that the microarchitecture actually seems to get significantly different in age between men and women, thanks to good old menopause. So yeah, it actually might become more of a level playing field as a microarchitecture or geometry.
We all function under the assumption that bone regulates strain, and I think it's a good idea, but we don't really know, and bone probably regulates a bunch of things, right? So it has many things that it has to deal with, not just stress fractures. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to take your approach and apply it to a semi-controlled environment. So instead of males and females, where we don't really have control over what they do, you're doing imaging, and then you're collecting statistics about a bunch of people, And can't we just do that with certain populations, like certain athletes? I guess my favorite would be baseball pitchers, because you also have the two sides of the body you can compare. But yeah, you have runners, you have sprinters, and you have long distance runners. I'm just wondering, is this approach not applicable to something like that, where you can collect, a lot of imaging data and you have some idea of the loads that people are experiencing?
Sure. From a subject-specific modeling standpoint, absolutely. You can look at someone's loads and create an individual-specific model for that and look at what their strains are. Statistically, something that you could look at if you had a whole bunch of imaging from, say, baseball pitchers, you can compare the pitching arm to the contralateral arm and pull out what the geometry differences there are, and you could probably model how it, if you could probably apply the same loads for the pitching arm to the contralateral arm and maybe see what differences are resulting due to that difference in geometry, which you can then quantify. You could also look at differences between groups. So the nice part is you can see which features actually vary between the groups and parse those out, and then see what those do to the strain and how each of them contributes to any differences that you might see on an individual standpoint. So yeah, I think it's definitely an application that you could apply to athlete groups. Maybe you could also look at, if you found a way to screen athletes who had, for example, a very narrow tibia, maybe from there you go and focus on those athletes, and then look at their other risk factors and what might predict who fractures and who doesn't.
Again, just a follow-up, I mean, another thing could be that maybe in the bone architecture and density, maybe women are more variable. Maybe strain is regulated on average, but maybe it's tighter regulated for whatever reason in males, less regulated in females. So you might have a larger variation. And of course, the weakest ones, you get the stress factor. So on average, maybe it's all regulated the same, except you have maybe a greater standard deviation. Did you ever look at what the standard deviations were in the shape factors and the densities, and were they bigger in males or females, or did they strike you as similar?
I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but we did find that a lot of the geometry and density differences were described by the third principal component. And those scores were statistically different between the males and females. That said, there was quite a bit of overlap, but the variance or the standard deviation within those two groups didn't look any different visually. I'd have to go back and look at those numbers exactly. But yes, there's a lot of overlap between the males and females, but the averages were statistically different, and I don't think the standard deviations were different between the groups. But yes, the females that have more narrow bones than the average female tibia would probably be at your very high risk, and someone that you might want to look into for, look at their other risk factors and make sure that those are controlled for or addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Is the presumption then that males, the cortex is more porous than females, or is there a difference in tissue mineral density?
It's a great question. I don't know. Yeah, it's the short answer. Again, with clinical CT, that apparent density is some combination of tissue mineralization and porosity. If I were to guess, I don't think that tissue mineralization would vary all that much in a young, healthy population. And so it's probably more porosity, but that is me guessing.
The reason I asked is because in adolescence, we see the same sex differences. So we see greater cortical bone mineral density in females, and we see larger tibias in males. and this was with the HRPQCT, but we didn't see a difference in cortical porosity.
Hmm.
So there was a bit of a conundrum there. It's likely because of the error in cortical porosity measures that if it is cortical porosity, we couldn't measure it to as precise a degree as we needed to.
Right.
But that's something we weren't able to answer. So if you want to do shape modeling on like 2,000 kids' bones, you can come see me.
Sounds good.
HRPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's trabecular bone structure is harder to deal with shape modeling because it works based on an anatomic correspondence. And so if you have so much variation in where those struts are, and they don't necessarily all correspond to the same location across people, it might be hard to pull out what is actual variation in geometry and what's just noise.
The data you're talking about would just be like distal tibia slices.
Yeah, like a hockey puck type.
All.
Now,
Question.
Yeah. So I have a few questions related to your statistical modeling.
Mhm.
So the first question is that your mean shape is based on your registered shape. So how
So the mean shape, so the shape that I used for registration.
at the panel, the event like when you perform principal component analysis, you will get another mean shape based on your registered subjects.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, how did you make sure that, have you checked your register sheet? Have you compared your register sheet with the original sheet individually?
Yes. Yeah, and the overlap is excellent. It's one of the things that we did when we were figuring out, how many surface nodes do I need, and what sort of mesh density do I need. I don't remember the RMSE off the top of my head, but it was close to the resolution of the CT images.
So you check the 3D then, like a deviation map between the original shape and the register shape.
Yeah, and they're really excellent. And we also made sure that I was checking the alignment to make sure that I wasn't getting any errors in the coherent point drift algorithm, getting anatomic correspondence, because sometimes if you have like in the diaphysis, because that diaphysis is really smooth and doesn't have a lot of features, sometimes you can get shifts that are artifactual, and that when you align the bones, you would kind of see that as the bone not being sort of translated in one particular direction. So that was another thing that I checked for to make sure that correspondence algorithm was working correctly and we weren't getting any artifactual shifts.
And when you use your statistical modeling to reconstruct a new shape of new subject, how many principal components do you consider, and what's your criteria to include those principal?
Right, so for the shape model only, for that initial prediction based on the 9 and 14 landmarks, we're using the first 8 principal components. And so that was based on analysis, bootstrap replication. So where you take a subsample of your training set, and so I guess it would have been 40, randomly selected, say 45 out of the 48 individuals. You create you apply the PCA and get the shape model from that. You do that random sampling and creation of the shape model. I think we had it 50 times. And then those resultant principal components were then compared to see whether or not they were stable, and whether those, the metric of how stable those modes were compared to the same calculation based on data that was just random noise. And so if those were compared and they were different from random noise, that was considered to be a relatively stable principal component. And so we were able to keep that in the model. The first time as you go along, PC 1, 2, 3, etc. The first time that is not different than noise, that's where we choose our cutoff. Most of the time, the choice of how many principal components to keep is arbitrary. A lot of times people say, oh, we want to keep the principal components that describe up to at least 80%, or we'll just keep the first 5. And so this was a bit more of an analytic approach to figuring out how many to keep. So that was the reconstruction. Now, with the average male and female, we were calculating that using just all of the principal components. We didn't want to decide which was noise and what was not. When I was comparing the scores, I compared the scores for the first 8 principal components.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
So you use if I understand your methodology correctly, so you use a few algorithmical location markers to scale your statistical model, to use that scaled one to represent the subject-specific shape, right? And then you use that optimization. So your optimization function is the minimization of weighted distance between those markers.
Yes.
So it's a rigid scale.
So it's, well, the first principal component is scaling, okay? But once you include the other principal components, that is morphing the shape. So it's changing the shape in order to better fit the distance, or to further reduce the distance between the model and target landmarks. So it is a locally deformable mesh that deforms based on those patterns that are described by the principal components.
Questions? Other questions? Go back to the one, I think we've talked about this before, the one that has really thick anterior cortex? With I think it's the density. Yeah, it is. Not these ones.
Not these ones?
No. This one, I think this one, yeah. Here, like, why do we get this very thick anterior cortex in the distal part of the tibia in this with this perturbation? Do you think this is real? Does that match any of the subjects that you saw, or is this just
To a certain extent. I think some of this is that I just haven't quite gotten the middle of the tibia for this cut, for this transverse cross-sectional cut. So I think if you have a wider tibia as well, and I cut at the same spot, you just might see a bit more density there. This is also plus and minus 2 standard deviations, so it is realistic. And I see that in 1 or 2 participants, but we're talking at kind of the levels of 98% of the population. So they are a little bit on the extreme side.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder what that tells us about the load, how the tibia is loaded in certain scenarios, and what it makes me think about the results of our finite element model, which I'm it doesn't make me feel that great when I look at this. And it's well, the bone strain must be really high here. If your body's going to great lengths to start depositing a bunch of bone there. But I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't. It's when you start looking, you wouldn't expect it in young, healthy people, but when you start really looking at this population, even just looking at the transverse cross sections, they can vary quite widely from shape. And for example, you can see in some of these participants, the transverse cross-sectional shape at mid-diaphysis is almost elliptical, whereas others have just really robust triangle shape. And so you get more variation than you'd actually expect in what's otherwise a rather homogeneous population.
If you made a comment, where you said that in stress fracture experiments in the lab, that a small difference in strain makes a large difference in the cycles, that to failure. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on how functionally that may be relevant or may not be relevant. So, for example, You know, if I just jog at a certain speed, 3 meters per second, then all of a sudden I run a bit faster, 5 meters per second. How much, I know presumably a little bit more, how much of a difference in strain would that actually make, and how much difference would that make in loading cycles? You know, for example, you know, if I can have 100,000 loading cycles before I break my bone, or 1 million, then the number is different. It's a great difference, but it really doesn't matter because, you know, I'm not going to load my bones 100,000 times in a row. You know, going out for a 10K run, and I load my one leg 5,000 times a row. So I wonder about the functional relevance of that. Is that just a laboratory result, or does that have practical implications for a runner, for example?
So when you use the strain or strain volume, often, I guess Brent can speak to this more with the Bible analysis, you get estimates of fracture sort of within that 5 to 8 week period. So it does seem to be, the measures of strain do seem to be reasonable. Michael, you'd probably know better about how much strain changes with an increase in speed.
Well, I knocked this over at Brent, but yeah, sure, strains go up if you run faster. It's like getting around that.
And then, so, you know, even if you increase your strains a little bit, that's going to have a much greater effect on the number of cycles before failure. Whether that leads to a stress fracture depends on whether you're doing that consistently over time for multiple weeks, as well as some other modifying risk factors that are going into whether you're at risk for stress fracture or not. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago. There are all kinds of risk factors for stress fracture. Bone geometry is just one of them.
Andy might correct me here, but I think cross-country skiers don't really get stress fractures. Why not? You know, elite cross-country skiers ski 365 days, 6 hours a day. A lot of loading there. Is the loading less, or the loading cycle less, or has it something to do with the rate of loading, the impact of action? Why don't we have some athletes that do extreme loading, you know, many times? Why don't they get stress fractures?
I don't know what the difference in strains and loading would be between running and cross-country skiing. It could be, if it's lower, that might explain some of the difference.
So your assumption would be that the strain is probably just lower?
It could be lower. On the other hand, it could also be that there are differences in the other risk factors like energy deficiency. Maybe runners tend to be more likely to be energy deficient, and that combined with maybe either that alone or probably combined with other risk factors, including geometry, might make them more prone to stress fractures than, say, cross-country skiers.
That's an interesting point, because I mean, a lot of elite, like all elite runners are incredibly skinny, you know, like there's 3% body fat, and I don't find that really in cross-country skiers. So I think runners might be more hung up on maybe eating habits than other athletes that are, or just, you know, is there a relationship between muscle mass and you know, going completely away from the bones? You know, if you are very muscular, does that protect you from stress fractures, even if you're a runner? Or is there a phenotype aside from muscles that might actually predict whether or not to get stress fractures or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not aware of anyone that's looked at that in particular. I mean, if you have larger muscles, you can also apply more force to the bone, and then, you know, your bone adapts to that in theory. So I'm not sure if that's whether larger muscles would be protective or not. Probably, but I don't think anyone's looked at that yet.
Just throwing things out there.
And it's average cadence. Cross-country skiing, definitely the cadence is lower than running.
Sure. Spun curves, yeah.
So
but you do it for 6 hours.
I also think cross-country skiers have to be incredibly energy efficient. I would have to think like incredibly energy efficient. So it's a really good question. I would reckon if somebody came to me and told me cross-country skiers don't get stress fractures, I would say I don't believe it.
Well, it's the same with cyclists. Cyclists ride for 6-7 hours.
Yeah, but in cyclists, their body weight is suspended, you know.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah,
largely
but
concentric.
it's slightly high. You think in cycling, I mean, in cycling, I think horses are low. That's my just. But they have, professional cyclists have really shitty bone density, right? Like all they care about is dumping as much weight as they possibly can. They're at a really bad risk for osteoporotic fractures, but they don't have stress fractures.
Maybe skiers get tendinopathies before they get stress fractures.
Lots of tendinopathies, there's lots of compartment syndrome. And but overuse like phenomenal. But stress fractures is, I'm sure some get it, but I don't know.
Arms.
Tendinopathies in the arms and shoulders.
So Walter's point with the, if I understood correctly, about how relevant are the changes in speed to what you see in the lab is a good question, because he's saying that nobody runs 100,000 cycles or 1 million cycles in one go. And so if you have a strain, if you run fast and you have a strain of 4,000 and the SN curve says that it's going to fail after 500,000 cycles, and then you run slower and now your peak strain is 3,500 microstrain, and now the curve says you're going to fail after 200,000. So you go from 500,000 to 200 or 100,000 cycles. That's the difference between the 500 microstrain that you get changes in speed. Is that relevant when a single running bout is only tens of thousands of cycles and not 500,000 cycles? Is that
I have
That's the question,
Yeah,
because
I have
I
saying it's
I
relevant.
run 10K, I take 1 meter steps, which is very short, let's say, and I'm landing 5,000 times my left leg. Even if I run 20 kilometers every day, then I would do 20,000 loading cycles on one leg. Sorry, 10,000 on one leg and 10,000 on the other. So the numbers would be relatively low.
Yeah, but it's the accumulation over time of all those loading cycles that matters. And there's also like odd load sequencing effects that we've not touched on, where when you go from high strain to low strain, you have more damage accrual at these low strain regimes than you would expect to. So there's all these other things that go into it. But the point of what I was going to say is that you load 10,000 cycles one day, you get some damage factor. You go running the next day, you get another damage factor, and they're additive over time. So
Are they? You don't ever repair?
You do repair, but it takes you 8-9 weeks, right? It takes a long time. I mean, you can see increases in periosteal circumference in military recruits after 8 weeks, but these are very small. So the delay, right, in the response to some mechanical stimulus, it's not going to
So
be
if I run
immediate.
10K a day and I get injured, but it takes 8 weeks to repair, then it's just a matter of time until everybody has stress fracture. Because
You'd have repair happening
If your
kind of
repair is-
consistently, but then if
your
you're,
repair is if your repair is 8 weeks, and your damage that you inflict is daily, then your bone will get weaker and weaker, and it would have to fail at one point.
Sure, and
So
in
at
some
one
people that
point,
does
when
happen.
you're a runner, if you're Eliud Kipchoge and you run 40 kilometers every day, and he never had a stress fracture in his life, somehow his repair must be faster than how he damages the body, I would assume.
That is a possibility. Yeah, I mean, this idea, like I talked to about the other week, is that if you take in less energy, you have reduced bone formation. So there's these biological factors that are interacting to produce different responses.
you also tend to get stress fractures when you've all of a sudden really increased your loading. So you see it in the military recruits when they're all of a sudden doing so much exercise And so I think it could come back to that that adaptation point. Your bones are adapted to a certain level of activity. If you really increase that, you're going to increase your strains so that you're accumulating more damage than. And then if that continues over time, 5 to 8 weeks later, you get a stress fracture.
Yeah, no, that to me makes a lot of sense. If you said all the people in this room, you're participating in this 100-kilometer racing more often. I would assume a couple of us would hobble away before we have done the 100 kilometers. That makes sense, but the idea that you have damage every day when you run, and it takes much longer to repair that. I mean, there's people who run all life long and never had a stress fracture. So that must be, there must be something must be missing there. There's some people reach an equilibrium and they just never have a stress fracture.
Yeah. I think in general the bone is well adapted to the loads it habitually experiences. I think that's just it. And then that's why somebody who's been running their entire life and it's not gotten a stress fracture probably will never get a stress fracture. But you see it when cross country, you see it a lot in cross country athletes, especially when in freshman cross country athletes that come in from their high school training regimen and now they're placed in a really intensive collegiate training regimen. And then the risk is always higher in the preseason after summer when they've been home eating chips all summer and sitting on the couch. It's high in the military. So I think to a large extent it happens when there's these large changes in a person's habitual, their physical activity, intensity of the physical activity. I think there's really good evidence that just shows that.
All right. Does that wrap everything up then? Okay. Thank you again. Next week for a visiting professor, former postdoc of Venom NIG, Dr. Wolfgang Schulhorn, who will be giving a talk titled Repetition Hinders Learning, Practical Consequences of Individual and Situated Movement Patterns. So see you all next week.